This video goes over short answer responses and how to revise them, how to make them a little better. We've been reading The Lottery by Shirley Jackson, and the first question I asked you was, how does the author use foreshadowing to increase suspense in the first 4 paragraphs of the story? Provide specific examples and explain their connection to the story's outcome. So before we go on, I really just want to take a look at this question. And it's important that we always look at the question, make sure we understand the question and what it's asking us to do. The topic of this question is foreshadowing. So you know that your topic sentence has to have something about foreshadowing. Even if you're just explaining what foreshadowing is, it gives us, the reader, an understanding of where you're going with the rest of your paragraph. Okay? But the task here is to provide specific examples and then explain. So you know you're going to have to provide a quote and explain why that's an example of foreshadowing and how it connects to the story's outcome. Remember that you need 5 different components. Think of a hamburger: topic sentence, answer, textual support, explanation, extension. Even if you have the first 4 of these things, that's way better than having none or having 1 or 2. Too many people skip straight to the answer, they forget about the topic sentence, and they don't give textual support to back up what they're saying. You have to give an explanation. You never want to end the paragraph with a quote. Here's someone's original response. The author used foreshadowing to increase suspense in the first 4 paragraphs of the story because Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in the box, and later in the story, the slip that was marked with coal, they died. So there's a lot of things wrong with this response. Now, I could tell that they had a basic understanding of what they should do. They started to explain what foreshadowing is. There's a quote in the middle, and there's an attempt at an explanation. There's not much of an answer here, and this is all one sentence. If you count the punctuation, this is one sentence. It's 4 lines long, but it's only one sentence. It's one big run-on sentence. So I get the impression that this student just wanted to rush through. This student just wanted to spit out an answer without giving detail and without having any type of structure. So all those things, if I'm grading you on a scale from 1 to 4, that's giving you a 1. A 1 for an honest attempt, but not a successful one. So let's look at what's wrong. Let's look at this first stem. The author used foreshadowing to increase suspense. I'm not sure if that's the topic sentence or an attempt at an answer. But there are a couple of things wrong here. Foreshadowing is not necessarily about increasing suspense, although it can. But foreshadowing has a different purpose. So let's help this guy out. Let's cut that out and recreate it. Just one topic sentence before we get to the answer. Foreshadowing is meant to give readers a clue about what will eventually happen in the story. So again, that might create suspense, but suspense is not necessarily what foreshadowing is meant to do. It's meant to give readers a clue. And you can take this sentence right out of your notes. This is just a basic sentence about what foreshadowing is. But the reason this is an important topic sentence, and a good one, is because it lets us know what the answer is going to be about. The rest of the paragraph is going to have to tie into foreshadowing. Let's look at that middle stem. In the first 4 paragraphs of the story, because Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slip of paper and put them in a box. Now, is that an answer, or is it textual support, or is it a little bit of both? There's obviously a quote there, but that's not necessarily a good quote, because Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves making up slips of paper and putting them in a box is not an example of foreshadowing. And without context, we don't necessarily understand why this student chose this quote. The fact is, there are a lot of examples of foreshadowing in the story, and we can find better ones. But before we get to the quote, you have to give a definite answer. So let's cut this out and write, in the first 4 paragraphs, the young boys were collecting stones. That's an answer, a simple one. That's not a long sentence. It's not complicated. It lets me know that in the first 4 paragraphs, the young boys were collecting stones, and I'll explain later why that's an example of foreshadowing. Another problem with the original quote, Mr. Summers and Mr. Graves made up the slips of paper and put them in a box, that didn't happen in the first 4 paragraphs. That happened later on. So it's important that the next sentence, the one with the quote, happens in the first 4 paragraphs and is specific to foreshadowing and the young boys collecting stones. So I'm going to cut that middle stem out, and I'm going to replace it with, in the second paragraph, Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed. Now notice what I did there. At the end of that quote, I used an ellipsis, ... A lot of times we use ... to mean a pause. But what it's meant to be used for is to let the reader know that this quote used to be much bigger, and we chopped it down. Let's take a look at that quote for a second. This is the original quote. It's huge. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Harry Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. That's a huge quote. I don't need all that. So what I used was just that first stem. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example. I didn't even use that last part, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. I cut all that out. Right? So you get rid of all that. That's just cutting out the fat. I needed that first part, and that's all I used. So I used an ellipsis to chop it down. But let's say I go back to that quote. And maybe I don't want to use the first part. Maybe I want to use that last part. Because that last part still works. Telling us that they made a great pile of stones, they put them in the corner and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. That shows that these kids felt that these stones were important. And that should have signaled us to think that these stones that they're collecting might be used for something more devious later. So let's say I chop all that out, that first part. And I go with the second part instead. That's still a pretty long quote. Bobby and Harry and Dickie, the villagers pronounced his name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. That's really long. And I don't need all of that. I don't need that middle part. The villagers pronounced his name Delacroix. That's extra. I could cut that out. And I could use an ellipsis the same way I did before to chop it down even further. So this works. If anybody wanted to use this quote instead, this totally works. But the reason I went with the other quote is because it's smoother. It's quicker. It didn't waste a lot of lines talking about Bobby and Harry and Dickie. I only got the point that I wanted to get across, which was that they were collecting stones in the beginning. So let's go back to the response. That part in gold or bronze, that's the part we've already edited and responded to. That last part, and later in the story, the slip that was marked with coal they died, that's from the original response. And that's a terrible explanation, although it's an attempt at an explanation. There's no attempt at an extension there. The fact that he even said they died. Who's they? Only one person died. Okay, so that's a bad explanation from the gate. We're going to chop that out. And we're going to change that to, later on, the reader discovers that the stones had a devious purpose. Now at this point, this is good. This is a good response. It has a topic sentence, an answer, a quote in the middle, and an explanation. But if you want to take it a step further, just add one more sentence and say the stones would be used to throw at the winner of the lottery. That extra sentence helps this paragraph sound a little bit more full and a lot more detailed. So let's review. Foreshadowing is meant to give readers a clue about what will eventually happen in the story. In the first 4 paragraphs, the young boys were collecting stones. In the second paragraph, Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed. Later on, the reader discovers that the stones had a devious purpose. The stones would be used to throw at the winner of the lottery. We have a topic sentence, an answer, a quote, an explanation, and an extension. This is a great revision. Keep this in mind as you answer the other questions in the document.